This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth starts off the show with information about winter grain mites. He explains if producers should be managing winter grain mites if they are seeing them in their fields this time of year. Continuing the show is Peter Tomlinson, K-State Environmental Quality Specialist, talking about using manure in fields. He specifically takes a deeper look at poultry litter. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk rounds out today's show by discussing new rules regarding antibiotics and options for limiting use. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show talking about winter grain mites. And to talk about them, we're joined by K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Sure, anytime. My pleasure.
Jeff, and why are we talking about winter grain mites right now?
This is the time of year. Every year in the last 40 years, we start talking about winter grain mites because, you know, there's really not much going on agricultural-wise except the wheat, right? The wheat's growing. Hopefully, this year it's really struggling. I was around several different places in south central and north central Kansas, and there's some not too bad-looking wheat, but there's some really bad areas. You know, it just depends on when it was planted relative to the little moisture that we have. Because of that, then, I've been getting calls about winter grain mites. And winter grain mites, as the name implies, are mostly around in the wintertime, although they can come around in the spring also. But in the winter is when we first start noticing. They're a cool weather mite. They're not an insect. They're an arachnid, actually. They like temperatures probably between 30 and 50 degrees or 60 degrees. They like cool, cloudy days, or they will feed at night for the most part. They're a mite, so they suck juice out of individual cells of the plant. As the wheat around the state is struggling for moisture in a lot of areas, these mites are competing with that moisture in that plant, and so they turn the leaves yellow. The tips sometimes will kind of turn brown because that's where a lot of the feeding occurs early on. But it actually can extend down the whole plant, can actually turn the whole plant yellow. Again, it's a combination of if we have good moisture, you know, I don't get any calls. In the fall when we have good moisture, in the spring when we have good moisture, I don't get any calls because the mite feeding is not noticeable. But like now when it's struggling, I get a lot of calls. They want to know if you should treat. And this time of year, I always recommend no. The wheat, if it's not in dormancy, is real close or will be in dormancy real soon. So the feeding that you have going on right now is really not going to hurt anything. The mites, once it gets a little bit colder, are going to go into dormancy themselves. They're going to lay eggs for the winter, and then there's not going to be any more feeding. It's just now, usually most years it's, you know, mid-November to early or mid-December that the mites are actively feeding. You got to remember it can get cold at night, but when it starts to get cold, the mites go down around the base of the plant and get in the cracks and crevices of the soil or under the residue. So it can be, you know, high 20s or mid-20s and not affect the mites, warm back up the next day or the next few days, and they'll get back to feeding again. So it takes a period of considerable cold weather before they actually start laying eggs and go into dormancy, but they will, and they always have. But even so, if the plants are up to the point where the mites are feeding on them, for the most part, they've got a pretty good root system established, we hope, and they're going to overwinter just fine. So the feeding that the mites are going to do this time of year is really not going to cause a problem. So, yeah, I know there's not much else going on. Everybody's out looking for anything in the wheat, but the winter grain mite is not anything really that we need to worry about this time of year. At least we put out trials for many different times, and we've just never been able to show any yield decrease later on or anything else to fall feeding due to winter grain mites.
So is it something that they'll possibly have to look at into a different season?
Yes, they will overwinter as eggs for the most part. And then as the wheat breaks dormancy in the spring, that's a different story. Again, if it's moisture stressed, and if it's like the past few years it might be, the mites will be there, and the mites can feed Again, they're competing for moisture with that plant. They're feeding on the individual cells of that plant. And when the plant is struggling to break dormancy and to start to grow in the spring, that's probably the time that wintergreen mites need to be watched a little more closely. Again, the wintergreen mite, to me, it's kind of a neat colored or neat or unusual arachnid or mite. Their bodies are kind of a dark color. I don't know if it's gray, green, black. You can see them with the naked eye, but not well. If there's a lot of them, you can see them on a plant, but generally you have to use, a little bit of magnification. And the legs are red. They have a little red spot on the back. It's called an anal pore. They're very uniquely colored. They move relatively slow unless they're getting off a plant. They're pretty shy, so when you approach, they can go down the plants or they just drop off a plant and they get into cracks and crevices in the ground. So it's really kind of difficult to determine how many you have per plant. The way we do it actually is go out at night. If you're really worried about it, you go out this time of year, you can find out how many. If you go out at night and use a flashlight, sometimes those plants look furry and they just look red. There's so many mites. There can be hundreds and thousands. Remember, they're really small. And it can really, I've gone out with growers at night with the flashlight. It really shocks you how many mites can be there with no apparent effect upon the plant. So just like I said, this time of year, remember the wheat's going into dormancy or is in dormancy, so that mite feeding is not going to hurt. Now, like we said, we started talking about spring. It could be a different story in the spring. If you have a good infestation or a bad infestation, depends on how you look at it. If you have a lot of mites in the fall, they're going to lay a lot of eggs, and those eggs probably aren't going to go away. Now, if you get a lot of thunderstorms or heavy rains, it will wash the mites away. It will wash the eggs away, so they'll go someplace else. They won't be there. But be that as it may, if you have a lot of mites right now, we have no big moisture events all winter, you're probably going to have a lot of mites in that area. Remember, they can't fly, they don't hop, they don't jump, they just crawl a little bit or sometimes are blown by the wind. So they're not going to go very far is what I'm saying. And they're going to feed on the grass, so they're going to look for wheat. As that wheat starts to break dormancy, they can feed on it in the spring. And if you got 20 to 50 mites per stem, per leaf, and the moisture is limiting. Remember, if it's dry and the wheat's struggling, you might consider spraying a miticide or an insecticide for wintergreen mites. Now, like I said, we've done that, and every time we spray, put out a miticide trial, we've had a big rain, and it's washed all the mites away. So we have none in the control. We have none any place. So nature will help you a lot. I wouldn't get too quick in the spring to spray, but again, if you have 20 to 50 per stem and it's dry and the wheat doesn't seem to be germinating as good or growing as good as it does in other places, you might consider a spot spray for wintergreen mites. But again, a big moisture event will take care of it.
And if producers had these guys last year, should they be worried about having them again this year?
Yes. Like I said, they don't go very far. As far as I know, there are not very many or any natural enemies, and they feed on grass. So generally they start from the side of a field, where you have some grass pasture or weedy areas where there's grass, and they move into the wheat field because that's what's green in the fall. That's they're basically their food source, and they lay eggs. And then in the spring, those eggs hatch, and they start another generation. Again, they're wintergreen mites, so they're only going to feed in the spring till it warms up. Once you get 80-degree temperatures, they're going to lay eggs again, and then those eggs are going to over summer, and then they're going to hatch again in late September, October, November, depending upon the weather, and the mites will start feeding. That's why we generally have 2 generations a year, the first in the fall and the second, in February, March, sometime when the wheat breaks dormancy.
Other than control insecticides, are there other management strategies for producers?
Well, not really. I mean, this is just not a problem. So we haven't spent a lot of research money to figure out other management strategies. We have no resistant varieties. The wintergreen mite is just not a big enough problem that they've spent a lot of research dollars trying to find strategies to help overcome it. Again, a big, nice rainstorm or hailstorm or snowstorm will move them. And a lot of times as that water moves, it takes them down to some place where there's a weedy area, or a grassy area along the field. That's what it's for. And they will gather there and they'll feed on that grass and it won't be a problem. But then in the fall, they'll start moving back out, or in the spring, whichever the case may be. The wintergreen mite is there. It's always going to be there. It's always going to feed on developing wheat or other grasses, but the wheat's a crop we worry about. And again, it only shows up and only causes concern in those years when we have limiting moisture, and like this year. As I said, I stopped in several different fields this last couple of days last week when the weather was nice. And in the fields with nice wheat, you could find a few wintergreen mites. They weren't causing any damage. In the fields where it looked like they'd been planted after the moisture came, or after the rain, or they didn't ever get any moisture, you could find wintergreen mites, and the wheat was yellow anyway. So whether it's the moisture or the mite, the fact remains the wheat's struggling. We need moisture, but do not spray. My recommendation is you don't spray for wintergreen mites in the fall. Just hold on and wait. But go out and check and see how many you have. That might portend infestation in the spring if moisture is still limiting at that time.
And Jeff, if people would like to find out more information about wintergreen mites, where can they do that?
Crop Insects of Kansas is a great source for all agricultural insect pests in Kansas.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about wintergreen mites.
Sure, my pleasure, anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. I will link the Crop Insects in Kansas book in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now discussing a recent Agronomy E-Update article. And then to talk about his article, we're joined by Environmental Quality Specialist at K-State, Peter Tomlinson. Peter, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning.
Peter, your recent article was titled Nutrient Availability in Poultry Manure. But before we kind of talk just about poultry manure, first off, why manure possibly an option for producers?
Yeah, so, producers looking at their soil fertility plan, manure is a great option that I would encourage all of our producers to consider. It's a great way to take advantage of fertility resource, and it also helps out our livestock producers in distributing that manure out to a broader area than just their operation where they may be challenged with excess nutrients.
And Peter, what makes manure manure?
Manure is the product of everything that the animal eats. And so it may be corn, soybeans, sorghum, maybe, corn stalks, hay that's growing and fed. And so, that the nutrients in the feed that the animal consumes, the animal utilizes a portion of those nutrients, but then what isn't utilized comes out the back end. So that is manure, depending on the facility, will influence, if we think about it in terms of the quality of the manure. Or in a feedlot setting, you may have soil mixed in with that manure. It's still good, but it gets to where we need to analyze our manure and know what the nutrient composition of that manure is. We're dealing with a dairy or a swine facility. That manure may just be the mixture of urine and feces. And in the case of poultry litter, it's a mixture of bedding, usually rice hulls or sawdust, and then wasted feed, and then the manure from the animal. And so it can be a great source of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium for our crops. And it also benefits our soil by adding organic matter back to that soil. And so, it can help to improve the overall quality of the soil in your cropping system.
And not all poultry manure is the same. It depends on what source it comes from?
It does, and this goes for all manures, depending on what particular growth stage an animal is at, what type of animal the manure comes from. Manures will have different compositions. And so in the e-update article, we provided some book values for different types of poultry. Laying hens, might be one source of manure producers in Kansas could access. And that's going to look a little different than, say, turkey or broiler litter that may be coming out of Oklahoma, Arkansas, or Missouri, particularly into the eastern part of Kansas.
So even with these values here, is it still worth producers taking the time to test it?
It is very important, and that would be my biggest recommendation is for a producer looking to take advantage of manure, it's really important to test that each load of manure that you're bringing into your operation. In the case of poultry litter, if the supplier can assure you it's all coming out of the same house, you just need to have a composite sample for that house. If we're thinking about other manures, feedlot, if it's all under the same management, a good composite sample will give you a good indication of what nutrients you can expect. And, that goes into calculating, if you're looking at your overall fertility plan, my recommendation is to utilize the manure to meet your phosphorus requirements and then supplement with additional commercial nitrogen. And this is twofold. One, the risk that we've got to be aware of with manure is that if we continue to apply manure on a nitrogen-based application rate, we will build up excessive phosphorus in our soil. And so if a producer that hasn't utilized manure recently, or if we start off on the right foot of applying it on a phosphorus-based approach, will reduce the risk of building up excessive soil phosphorus. And then it also provides a bit of risk management for the producer because, depending on the weather after application, depending on the manure source, there can be some variability in when the nitrogen becomes available. If it's in organic forms, it's going to have to be mineralized and broken down by microorganisms to eventually become available as inorganic forms. And so if you're applying on a phosphorus-based approach, you're going to need to add additional commercial nitrogen. And so you can view the manure as your slow-release nitrogen, and then the commercial nitrogen is that readily available nitrogen that you need for your crop when it gets going in the spring.
And are there differences for how quick those nutrients will be available to your crops you're applying it to?
Yes. So, if we look at the e-update article on poultry litter, I go through and provide some detail. In the case of poultry litter, we would expect about 75 to 80% of that nitrogen to be in organic forms that are going to need to be broken down, mineralized before they're available. The other 20 to 25% would already be in inorganic forms, and so that would be readily available for a growing crop. But again, if you're applying on a phosphorus base, this is where you can apply some additional commercial nitrogen fertilizer to meet your crop's nitrogen needs. In the case of phosphorus, we would expect that, we provide a range of 50 to 100% would be available, and that's just, there's a lot of variability in manure and how it's been handled in different operations. Even within poultry manure, there can be quite a bit of variability. But again, if you have been managing your soil test P under, say, build and maintain or sufficiency approach, and you've got upper end of low to medium levels of phosphorus, I think you're safe to assume that 100% of that P will become available. If you're in a situation where you have very low or low soil test P, again, this comes to a bit of risk management. You'd want to back off that assumption in terms of P availability to make sure that you have sufficient phosphorus available for your growing crop.
And as we're thinking about just applying manure, any type of manure, what are a few things that you really want to make sure producers think about before doing it?
Yeah, so as for producers who are thinking about utilizing manure, I think first off we need to think about, are we going to be able to haul that manure from the facility directly to our field and apply it, or do we need to haul it during the summer and fall and stack it at the field edge to be applied, later in the fall or early winter? Identifying good locations to store that manure is important. We want to make sure that it's not going to, if we get a large rain, that we're not going to see that manure and the runoff from that manure pile entering a county ditch that could eventually enter one of our many streams or water bodies across the state. And so just being conscious of where we're stockpiling and storing that manure is important. Two, making sure, particularly if we've stockpiled, it's probably worth retesting that manure before we calculate our application rate. If it's sat in a pile for a couple of months, even though you may have an analysis when it was in the barn, it's worth reanalyzing that and making sure that we've got the most up-to-date information in terms of the nutrients that are going to be available from that manure. The spreading equipment, it's strongly recommended, if you've gone to the trouble of analyzing the manure, that we don't forget to calibrate that application equipment and make sure that, we're applying the manure at the right rate. And then, thinking about, good stewardship practices, making sure that we have some setbacks from streams, even, terrace channels. We want to make sure that we stay about 100 feet back and provide some buffer zones, and it's not necessarily, edge of streams would want to be at least 100 feet away from that. Where we've got terraces, we want to make sure that we have some soil that hasn't received manure application before that, if it's a tile outlet terrace, that there's some area to hopefully absorb those nutrients for draining into a grassed waterway. Again, we just want to make sure that we're not applying through that waterway, because that will provide some filtering and retention of those nutrients before they eventually reach, one of our big water bodies.
That was K-State Environmental Quality Specialist Peter Tomlinson. I will link his agronomy e-update in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Antibiotics have been used in livestock care for more than 60 years for the prevention and therapy of common pathogens, such as mastitis, respiratory and foot diseases, and other purposes. The big issue now, though, is antibiotic resistance. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that producers can reduce the need for antibiotics in the herd through nutrition and by providing a healthy environment that stays clean and dry.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the actual use of antibiotics on your dairy. This summer we started operating under some different rules as we look at antibiotic use on our dairy farms and other animal production farms here in the United States. As you well know, prescriptions are now required for all antibiotics that we might use in animal production. The availability of over-the-counter antibiotics without a vet prescription will be reduced as we move forward and eliminated. So as we think about what's going on, the big issue is antibiotic resistance, and how do we make sure that we only use antibiotics in situations where they're actually needed. So working with a veterinarian will improve the use of antibiotics on your dairy, and it will also help us reduce the overall use of antibiotics in animal production. Now, specifically for dairy, some things that you might want to visit with your veterinarian about. How do you actually avoid the need for antibiotics? In other words, how do we have healthy animals? So key factors there to consider would be, number one, the immune system. So trying to have diets that are very nutritious and support a healthy immune system would be a key factor there. Some other things that will help you in that regard would be a healthy environment. You know, when you think about the environment and particularly stress, as animals are in higher stress situations, they're more likely to have issues with a lower production from their immune system, and they're more susceptible to disease, which may result in the need for the use of antibiotics. So if we can keep them in an environment that is stress-free, and particularly when we're thinking about the calves on our dairy, making sure that it's an environment where they stay clean and dry. And when we start having winter exposure, making sure that we're doing the correct things to keep them comfortable, even though the weather outside might be a little bit less than desirable. So as we think about the environment, another big factor here in reducing antibiotic use on our dairies will be actually the reduction of disease exposure. So sanitation procedures as well as replacing bedding when it should be will all reduce exposure that animals have to bacteria. The final thing that you need to consider is your vaccination programs. And again, bring your veterinarian, your health care folks in on this discussion so that you can make sure you're using an appropriate vaccination program to prevent many of the diseases that we sometimes see in our dairy herds. Some final thoughts of things that we can do to reduce the actual use of antibiotics on dairies. Some folks are considering increased use of entomologist bactrins, and that may be a possibility on some of our dairies depending on what we're dealing with. And again, you'll need to be working with a veterinarian to identify the right things and develop the bactrins that are most effective on your dairy or your animal operation. Finally, there will be some increased use of plant-derived products that reduce the exposure and the effects of various bacteria. So there are some things that I think we will see come to the market in a greater effort that could be used in place of some of our antibiotics. I guess the take-home message really here is, yes, there is a desire to reduce the use of antibiotics in our animal production systems. Just keep in mind that in certain cases we still are going to need to use antibiotics to effectively fight disease and for the health of our animals. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.